University of North Dakota. She got along with people very easily. She joined a sorority, which she really loved being part of, and she was very social. She also had 2 jobs, and she worked as a waitress at night at a bar, and she worked at Victoria's Secret during the day in the Grand Forks Mall, while in the Columbia Mall in Grand Forks. And she had a great boyfriend named Chris, and she was just, happy in life. So on November 2nd, 2003, she was working in Victoria's Secret in the Columbia Mall, and her shift finished around 4. And she was planning to go do some shopping around the mall before she would head to her job as a waitress. So when she finished shopping around 5 p.m., she called her boyfriend Chris on her way back to the car. This is something that she did almost every day. She would always call her boyfriend while she was walking towards her car. And at a certain point, Chris said that he heard her say, okay, 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 and then the call went dead. Now, he said that she didn't sound frantic, or it didn't sound like there was something bad happening, so he assumed that she was either talking to someone or she had really bad cell reception and the call just dropped. So he expected her to call back when her cell service was better. However, she never called him back. Then 3 hours later, he received a call from Dru's cell phone, but it wasn't Dru on the other side. It was just noises. It was a static noise and what sounded like the buttons being pushed on Dru's phone. So Chris then called her mom, and her mom in turn called Dru's dad, who lived nearby, and asked him to go check up on her. Now, they also found out that she had never showed up at her work as a waitress, so they obviously immediately then thought something was wrong. And when Dru's dad arrived at the parking lot of the mall, he saw that her car was still parked there, but it wasn't parked in her normal spot. Now, Dru is a real creature of habit. She did everything per routine. She didn't really, you could predict everything she was going to do, so the fact that she was parked in a different spot was really, really strange to them. Now the driver's door was locked, but the passenger door was unlocked, which again is really bizarre. And some of the things that she had bought that afternoon were scattered either inside or outside the car. There's different reports on it, so I'm not sure which one is true. But they were they weren't in boxes or in their shopping bags. They were kind of just all over the place. And there was also a bloody knife she found near her car. Now, they'd already called authorities before to report Dru as a missing person, so they eventually showed up at the parking lot to investigate the scene. But Dru's dad decided to stay as well. He didn't want to leave. He was going to wait there until Dru showed up, but she never did. They also called all her friends, but nobody had heard from her other than Chris. He was the last person to speak to her. Now, the media picked up this case and spread it like wildfire. It was partly because of her family and partly because of her sorority. They really pulled together to alert the media and to make sure that this case was in the news. Now, Dru herself was from Minnesota, and apparently Minnesota and North Dakota are very tight-knit communities. I'm guessing, I probably should have looked this up, but I'm guessing that she lived near the border. So both the communities in Minnesota and North Dakota really came together to search for her. They organized a lot of search parties. Many different people just voluntarily searched for her. And this was like at a really cold time of year. There was a lot of snow on the ground, but it didn't deter anyone. They all kept searching for her. Now, authorities also really got into this case and did a lot of So they searched that area, and they found a bloody shoe that belonged to Dru. So this, in combination with the bloody knife sheaths that they found near her car, didn't predict much good. Now, witnesses came forward and said that they saw Dru give a quick ride to an older man to his car. I'm not entirely sure how they know this, because I don't know if they saw the whole thing and they saw the man get out and get in his own car. It would explain why her car wasn't in her own spot. So either they saw this, she dropped off this man at her car and then parked her car somewhere else for some reason, or they didn't actually see this, they just assumed it. But this man is actually the one that took her. Now, authorities definitely believe that this older man is the one who tricked her into becoming his victim. So they checked all the areas around the mall for sex predators, specifically those with a prior conviction for kidnapping. And by December 1st, which is, like, she went missing on November 22nd, so that's like 2 weeks later, they already had a suspect. I just want to say, like, kudos to the police, because how often do we cover cases where it just takes a really long time to find anything, or where authorities just take a really long time to believe that someone is actually missing? Like, the police really jumped on this case and did a really good job. So they found a 50-year-old level 3 sex offender named Alfonso Rodriguez. Now, this was obviously not his first run-in with the law. In 1974, he committed 2 counts of rape, and in 1975, he was sentenced to jail for 15 years for those rapes. But in 1979, so 4 years later, he was already released. Then in 1980, a year after his release, he stabbed a woman and tried to abduct her. So he was sentenced for that to 23 years in jail. But in May of 2003, just a few months before Dru was abducted, he was released. Now, actually, I thought that he was also released early, but if he was released in May of 2003, that is actually 23 years later. So he was in jail for the full 23 years, but he was released just a few months before Dru went missing. So he is brought in for questioning, and he admitted that he was in the area of the Columbia Mall in Grand Forks that day, but that he couldn't have kidnapped Dru because he was in a movie theater at that time. He claimed that he was watching the movie Once Upon a Time in Mexico. Now, police looked into this and found that that movie wasn't playing in any movie theater in or around the mall at that time. So basically his alibi was false. They then looked into his transaction history and found that he had multiple transactions in the Columbia Mall at the time that Dru was kidnapped. So they decided to search his car and found a bloody knife soaking in some kind of solution that was meant to clean it. They obviously connected this bloody knife to the knife sheath found near Dru's car, and they also found blood spatter in his car. Now, it doesn't seem to be published anywhere whether they found that this blood belonged to Dru or that the blood on the knife belonged to Dru. I would imagine that even back then they would have done analysis on stuff like that and found it. I just couldn't find whether they were able to connect it or not. Now, on April 17th of 2004, so like 6 months later, really, Dru's mom received a phone call from the command center, and when they do searches for people, they always set up a command center somewhere, and they said they needed to talk to her about something. Now, she immediately knew that the call sounded different, and everyone knew that Dru's body had been found, and in a drainage ditch near Crookstown, Minnesota, Dru's body was found. Now, the phone call pinged near Crookstown, and Rodriguez lived with his mom in Crookstown. So she was half clothed, her wrists were tied behind her back, and she was brutally attacked. She had a 5.5-inch gash on her neck, and there was also a rope tied around her neck that had pieces of a shopping bag in it, which made investigators believe that at some point that rope was meant to hold a shopping bag in place that was over her head. Now they took her to the coroner's office to perform an autopsy, and they came up with 3 possible causes of death. She either died from the wound caused by the gash in her neck, from suffocation from the bag over her head, or from exposure to the elements. That one really bothers me. I mean, they all bother me, but imagine that she has a wound deep enough in her neck that it could be the cause of death. But she may not have died from it. She may have actually just died from the cold and been out there wounded for so long, which just is, I don't know, that's just really creepy. They took fibers and hair that they found on Dru, and they ended up being a positive match to Rodriguez. So at least the suspect they were officially able to arrest. Now, because Rodriguez crossed the state border from North Dakota to Minnesota, it became a federal case. I'm guessing what they mean by that is that Dru was killed in North Dakota or captured in North Dakota, but she was killed in Minnesota. Now, this made everyone really happy because both Minnesota and North Dakota don't have the death penalty, but the federal government does. Now, they did a lot of psychological investigations into Rodriguez. They wanted to make sure that this man actually knew what he was doing and that he was sane enough to stand trial, because they figured, he's raped women before. A year later, like a year after his release, he tried to kidnap someone, and then he was in jail for 23 years, and again, a few months after he came out, he murdered another woman. So, is he actually mentally ill, or does he know what he's doing? But they did many evaluations, and they found that he was sane, and he knew what he was doing, and he was perfectly able to stand trial. So, on December 22nd of 2006, Rodriguez was found guilty for the murder of Dru, and he was sentenced to the death penalty by the jury, and it was the first death penalty sentence ever to take place in North Dakota. Now, there's a couple of things afterwards. So, he said that he picked Dru because she was on the phone in a parking lot, and she was not paying attention to her surroundings, and she didn't even notice that he was following her, so it was very easy for him to take her. Also, when she got in her car, she put the keys in the ignition but left her driver's door open, presumably because she was still on the phone. So it was very easy for him to overpower her and take her. So I just want to say that a lot of people are on the phone when they're walking at night because it gives them a sense of safety. It makes them think that people won't attack them because there will be a record of the attack. But in a lot of cases, and actually human traffickers have said this as well, they very often pick people who are on the phone because they're not paying attention. So my little warning to you guys is, be careful. I understand the being on the phone thing, but at least make sure that you regularly look around and see that there's no one behind you. Also, I think it's fine if you're on the phone when you're taking like an Uber. A lot of people do that in an Uber for the whole ride, just to have that, an Uber, keep talking to me so that this guy or woman or whoever it is doesn't take me somewhere. But I think it's different when you're walking somewhere alone. 5 p.m. that time of year, it would have been dark. I'm assuming that the parking lot was fairly empty because I think only 2 people came forward to say that they saw her with this old man. So just be careful when you do that. Also, whenever I walk, I live in Ireland. I live in a small town in Ireland. It's pretty safe here. I don't feel in danger at all. But even when I walk back to my car at night, the first thing I do is lock the doors. Always. I get in, I put the key in the ignition, and before I even start the engine, I lock the doors. Just an extra bit of safety. Now, the positive thing to come out of all of this is that because of this case, the sex offender registry was set up. I'm sure we've all heard of the National Sex Offender Registry. They mention it a lot. Like, if you're not in the United States, they mention it a lot on like fictional TV shows. It's basically a registry where you are obligated to put your name in if you've been offended, if you've been convicted for sex crimes, and it allows anyone, like it's on a website, you can access it. It's public information for anyone to find out if there's a sex offender living in their neighborhood. Now, this is officially called the Dru Sjodin National Sex Offender Registry, which I didn't know. I think that aside from the fact that something horrible had to happen to her for this to exist, I think it's a great thing to come out of it that this exists. And I do have issues with it sometimes. I feel like sometimes, for example, if an 18-year-old has a relationship with a 15-year-old that's completely consensual, if the parents of the 15-year-old sue him and win like statutory rape, he very often has to go on the registry, which I don't agree with. I don't think everyone on there is a genuine sex offender. But overall, I think it's a really good thing to come out of this. And I think it also allows police to kind of catch suspects faster. So that's it for this case. I hope you like this, which is always a weird thing to say about a true crime case.